This was what I intended to say if I had been elected in 2016. My fellow Americans, today you sent a message to the whole world. I don't know who created Pokemon Go, but I'm trying to figure out how we get them to have Pokemon go to the polls.
Yes, welcome the new pre-roll advertiser masterclass there. Hillary, we never did figure out how to get them to make Pokemon go to the polls, at least enough, and alas, we were never able to hear the speech, and now you can pay a company to see her delivered into it while she sits in a chair. So,
man, that's some decline of Western civilization stuff. Like, forget what's happening in colleges. The fact that, former presidents of the United States and people who came pretty close to beating the big bad orange man are now selling, motivational videos for $50 a pop.
Yeah.
On masterclass.com is pretty depressing.
If I would have won, this is what I would have said. Suck my you-know-what, you orange Cheeto. It was all me. And this is a vindication of everything I've done and every decision I've made, including
Do you think Joe Biden would have gone on the same kind of tour if he had lost? Like, if Joe Biden had lost to Trump in round 2, do you think you would still be hearing kind of mad conspiracy theories about, I don't know, how Kanye cost Joe Biden the election? I don't think so. I think Joe would ride off into the sunset, I feel like.
He'd pull the LBJ and just disappear, I think, and be gone after. Like, he wouldn't have survived
Trump's
Trump's
term. He already
term.
is in a lot of ways.
Yeah, no shit.
But yeah, no. All solidarity with Susan Sarandon, who I think would be a much, much better president than Hillary Clinton.
We got to play that Mike Racine TikTok about how he was all ready to vote for Hillary until Susan Sarandon showed her cleavage.
Jesus Christ, Mike.
Anyway.
We got a full one for y'all. In a little bit, we're going to be talking about Barbados, which has finally bucked the monarchy, but Barbados, like many other countries, is fighting a much, more entrenched demon, and that is international finance and global capitalism. And a little bit later, we're going to be returning to one of Matt and I's favorite topics, why Elon Musk is just a complete fraud who should be receiving no government money, and in fact, whose companies and assets should certainly be brought into public control very, very soon.
Yeah, one goal I would say of this show is to make it toxic. So instead of politicians thinking they get some sort of boost by appearing on a platform with this guy, it needs to be toxic, particularly Democrats. But everyone, this guy needs to be seen as a charlatan and a waste of public funds. I mean, the Las Vegas tunnel thing is just one example. He's having meetings with municipalities all over the place for all sorts of reasons, including, of course, in Texas with the factories, and it's got to stop.
He's a serious fraudster, and he's nothing new. I mean, the Elon Musk kind of business strategy is as old as capitalism itself, right? You get governments to protect you and give you money, be fraudulent, intimidate your workers and potential whistleblowers and people who are working within your company, even people who are in the C-suite. I don't know. We got a lot of that to get to later. And also Teslas, those cars, they sort of suck. But before we get there, and before we get to Barbados, Matt, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this, GOP crack up. I'm sure y'all probably mentioned a little bit on MR, but there was a recent kind of spat between everybody's favorite action figure come to life, Dan Crenshaw, and the rest of the Freedom Caucus.
This has not been on MR. This is brand new content.
Oh, nice. Well, I'm happy to break it for y'all. This is just interesting. Next week, we're going to be joined by Liza Featherstone to talk a little bit about Josh Hawley and how the right is trying to use, masculinity and the kind of freak out over masculinity to their advantage. I'm really looking forward to that conversation. But Crenshaw, I think, runs in a similar kind of area as Hawley does, and I think he's an interesting kind of political force, and I think. You should be putting your eyes a little bit more on the cues and the actions that he's doing than maybe the guys who are bringing the headlines. Because I feel like Crenshaw has much more of a line in with Republican leadership and the major donors than, for example, Boebert does. And I don't mean this because, like, obviously what Boebert's done and what a lot of these other people are doing is absolutely despicable. But I'm just seeing like what that party, the Republican Party, the party that controls the state that I live in, where they're like really starting to turn. And I think it's been interesting to see where people are going post-Trump. But anyways, enough introduction. This is Dan Crenshaw at an event for losers called the Texas Liberty Alliance, sort of throwing some shade at other members of the Freedom Caucus.
These two. There's actually other veterans in Morgan's race. There's other front runners. So why support these two? Well, because I've been in Congress for almost 3 years now. There's two types of members in Congress. There's performance artists and there's legislators. Now, the performance artists are the ones that get all the attention. They're the ones you think are more conservative because they know how to say slogans real well. They know how to recite the lines that they know that our voters want to hear. Let me tell you guys something. In the first 2 years of Trump's presidency, when Republicans were in control, when every single time we were voting on Donald Trump's agenda, who do you think was at the top of that list voting with Trump, and who do you think was at the bottom? A lot of names you would recognize were at the bottom of that list. A lot of names you would recognize are at the top of that list. Number two, it's probably going to make you cringe a little bit. It's Adam Kinzinger. Voted with Trump almost 99%. He was number two. And who's at the bottom? Everybody in the Freedom Caucus. All of them. What you hear so often is not true. It's not true. We have grifters in our midst. Not here, not like in this room, that's not what I mean. I mean in the conservative movement. Lie after lie after lie, because they know something psychologically about the conservative part. We're worried about what people are going to do to us, what they're going to infringe upon us.
There are probably, there's not a lot that I agree with Dan Crenshaw on, but I'll tell you one thing that is almost a truism that you could say about any kind of group of, major conservative movements in America. There are grifters among us, right? I think this is an interesting kind of clip, and the media has been, the liberals who are just so excited to embrace Republicans into their arms, obviously are having a lot of fun with this, saying like, oh, wow, Dan Crenshaw, returning us to like normalcy and truth in the GOP. Let's not forget that I think just the other day he gave a speech out front of the Capitol talking about how the Democratic Party is a better kind of spy operation than anything that the Kremlin could have come up with at the height of the Cold War. So let's not, let people get away with any of these kind of fantasies as to what Crenshaw is saying, because Crenshaw was certainly a part of this wing. And I don't find this to necessarily be Crenshaw sort of finding his spirit and his backbone, but actually sort of showing which way the winds are blowing within the Republican Party.
Yeah, Dan Crenshaw, before he was a congressperson, was a moderator of a far-right conspiracy Facebook group. This was a Tea Party Republicans one. Again, when you say far-right, you also mean like standard GOP populist.
Absolutely.
Right? But this type of stuff, like the type of things that these sorts of groups say about like BLM protests or Muslims just living lives, is, he was a moderator for this exact same thing with like these other sort of Pizzagate type folks, right? And you're right in the fact that he is clearly someone who has the ear of well-connected folks, right? Like they're right. The Republicans will deal with like Boeberts and Marjorie Taylor Greene's because they need that energy. And it's like tax cuts for corporations don't do that for that. And there's a certain point where like the Rand Paul type of defense libertarianism isn't really doing it anymore either, when you have Ilhan Omar and stuff elaborate. But yeah, like, I mean, I also want to quickly say, I agree. I respect the point about Kinzinger, because that's the thing about all these little guys that like to say as if they're sort of, and even they're like portrayed as rhinos, but no, like they're right there with the sort of establishment Republican agenda.
Well, I mean, I think the bigger point here is what Trumpism sort of represented, like materially, right? Not, what it looked like on TV, not what it looked like symbolically, but what was the Trump government, basically like in power. I mean, it was conservative policy on autopilot. And I think for the GOP, while they can whenever you're the party that's out of power, you can just sort of point, to like the establishment, right? But I think it is a little bit difficult to do that with Biden, because Biden is continuing so many of the worst and most barbaric policies of Trump. You don't have to look any further than the U.S.-Mexico border to see how Bidenism has actually not been this huge shift when it comes to policy, right? And you realize that, a lot of it, as Crenshaw knows better than most, that most of politics actually is about puffing out your chest and being a performance artist. So it's pretty rich to hear him say that. But
I mean, maybe we mentioned the Marvel commercials.
Do not forget, if you did not see these, I mean, he did these commercials where he was jumping out of helicopters, to fight Antifa. I mean, this is a guy who's as much of a performance artist as it gets. But what does this sort of represent? We don't really spend too much time getting worked up about, congressional politics on this show, because a lot of it really is just theater. But I do think it's worthwhile to note, why is Crenshaw doing this? And I have a couple hypotheses about that. Mainly, I think it's that the Republican Party itself is like having an internal reckoning. Not that they think they've gone too far or they're frightened. Like, people keep on saying that there's been this big shift in the Republican Party since like the, January 6th protests, right? And I don't really think that that's been the case. I mean, some people for sure were sort of ostracized for a little bit, but for the most part, they've been warmly re-embraced. Where I do think it's starting to become a problem for them is that there is a wing of the Republican Party that is not answering the kind of traditional donors and leadership of the Republican Party. All you have to do is look at the race for state office here in Texas to see, Abbott is being challenged by, Yahoos for sure, but, people on his right, and I'm sure Abbott looks like he's going to walk away with it. But I do think that you can see within the party, like the leadership is getting worked up about all these new folks. We talked about it a few weeks ago when we were talking about Nikki Haley in South Carolina. Nikki Haley is now giving speeches at the Heritage Foundation about, this right-wing populism and how those people aren't actually conservative, right? So you are starting to see within like the Republican establishment this pushback. And I think loyal foot soldiers like Crenshaw, I mean, as much as Crenshaw likes to present himself again as an outsider, I mean, this is a boy who went to school in Europe. Like a fancy private school in Europe. This is not a good old boy, who grew up, in Texas. This is a guy who's silver spoon in his mouth his whole life. And, he's going to pick up the phone when he gets these kind of calls. So, we'll definitely have to, I definitely want to do a lot more in-depth stuff about actually what the kind of political economy of the Republican Party represents today, because I think there's a lot of nonsense about it sort of now becoming a new working class party, which is certainly not true. But I also think that a lot of people are sort of missing that, like, the fact that, like, there has been a shift in what the GOP represents and who they're answering to. You are starting to see some kind of major donors and extremely wealthy folks move away from the Republican Party toward the Democratic Party. And I think it is worth sort of analyzing what that is. I think the top line answer, certainly, that both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are not very ideological. When you have two big kind of catch-all parties, you have very incoherent, internal politics. And the fact that there has been a kind of, I don't know, populist upswing over the past couple of years probably creates some opportunities for more fringe elements to move into power. But again, the Republican Party, the people who vote Republican, the people who run this show are super, super wealthy folks. But again, I don't know, like there's a lot to talk about the Republican Party. I think it would be really interesting to start maybe do a whole episode in depth on that.
I mean, that's how massive, I guess, unequal our economy is, that populism for the GOP, like you look at Boebert and Taylor Greene, and I assume some the other ones you could name, and they're all business owners, right? And they genuinely do represent populism in the GOP, but of like the small,
like a small business, like regional, a small burger populism, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, Boebert literally like Smokehouse 1776, right? Like. It's the populism of let me give people diarrhea and not like let me like pollute the entire river basin. And I mean, of course, they can work together on a lot of things, but sometimes they're not always aligned, especially on their personal sort of ambition, I think.
Yeah, I mean, basically to put a bow on it for now, it's just like what you see from that clip is that one, Trumpism sort of did not represent this huge shift from traditional Republican governing, but the theater certainly changed around it. You're seeing tensions within the Republican Party basically around that, because I do think that there is a kind of base of the Republican Party that I think the leadership has lost. Sort of management over. And, just like the Democratic Party likes to manage and control their voters, the Republican Party wants to do the same thing.
I mean, the Republican Party has a lot less, I think, at least recent muscle memory in terms of doing that. Like, I don't really know what like Democratic Party, that's their main bag. They got that shit on lock. GOP, like, they usually can't afford to. But yeah.
Well, we're about to go to our interview, but I just want to let people know that this is a great time to show up and support the show at patreon.com/leftreckoning. This weekend, I'm really excited for this. It's going to be our first Lenin reading. And we're going to be reading a very early text written by Lenin on the kind of key tenets and principles of Marxism. It's a really short text, but I'm really looking forward to reading that with Matt. And we're also going to be talking about an later piece of Lenin, 1918, a letter to the American workers, which is a really fascinating document right after, in the kind of height of the Russian Revolution. Lenin writing to the American workers. And I think there's a lot of interesting kind of like history. How were people in the early Soviet Union viewing American history over like the past 100 years is really interesting. And two, sort of seeing those kind of early formations of an international workers movement. But to catch that on Sunday, join us at patreon.com/leftreckoning.
All right. And we'll take a quick break and we'll be back with Tamanisha, John, folks. See you in a little bit. We are back. I'm Matt Leck. With me as ever, David Griscom. And Tamanisha John, she's an assistant professor in international relations from Clark Atlantic University in Atlanta. Tamanisha, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. And I will say Clark Atlanta University because people get upset when you say Clark Atlantic.
Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta. Thank you for the correction. Let's talk about Barbados. What should be big news to all citizens of republics on this earth, but maybe isn't as covered as I think it should have been. Barbados is is freeing themselves from the British Queen, basically. What does it mean to be? Or actually, before we get to that part, give us a sense of Barbados. What was the colonial history that you think is, I mean, obviously an important plantation island for Britain, slave trade in the slave trade and sugar trade. What's the colonial history that in Barbados that people should know about?
Okay, so to start this story, I will say that when we talk about Barbados becoming a republic, what you could classify Barbados prior to that was a constitutional monarchy where they had the queen as a figurehead, as ceremonial or symbolic figurehead. And what that meant is that although Barbados gained its independence in 1966, essentially the queen still had limited governing powers because Barbados didn't reform its constitution. And so when we talk about a state now becoming a republic, or, in the past, or even now in the present, what we're talking about is the state finally choosing to undergo some sort of constitutional reform. And so prior to Barbados becoming a republic, Barbados did not undergo any sort of constitutional reforms. And so it still maintained a lot of British social and legal traditions, as well as the Westminster system. And so when they get rid of the Queen as the head of state and they declare themselves a republic, what they're necessarily shedding is this, British social and legal tradition, as well as the fact that they retained a lot of, colonial leftovers. And so what is the significance of Barbados becoming a republic? As people may or may not know, Barbados was the first plantation economy in the Caribbean and in the Americas that Britain, established its, slave societies in. Britain decided to claim Barbados as its own in 1625, and you really started to see white settlers moving in and setting up the plantation economy there in around 1627. And as Britain's first slave society in the Caribbean, you had it where Barbados and sugar was so successful that by 1650, Britain was successfully outcompeting Spain in the Americas. And when you talk about Spain's involvement, you of course are talking about a huge swath of South America, Central America, some of the, closer to southern U.S. places like those. And so the slave society of Barbados was so profitable that it literally put Great Britain as a large competitor against Spain in the Western Hemisphere. As all slave societies, slavery was brutal there. But what you also had established in Barbados was a Victorian plantation social system as well, whereby permanent settler tourists were encouraged by Britain to essentially go into Barbados, set up and establish and, create their entrepreneurial futures there. And so as early as the 1700s, Barbados was regarded as, what people would now say or now call Little England, but it was really seen as the crown jewel of Great Britain because it was such a profitable colony. And so when we discuss the colonial history of Barbados, it is important that Great Britain first established its plantation slave society in Barbados, but also that it enriched Great Britain so much to the extent that Great Britain could become a dominant hegemon in imperial expansion in the Americas. And so as Britain expanded its sugar production throughout the Caribbean, Barbados continued to remain that crown jewel for settlers from Britain who wanted to go and live on the islands. That was their preferred place of choice. And as its preferred place of choice, you saw the establishment of a more sophisticated capitalist class in Barbados than you saw anywhere else in the Caribbean. And then this, of course, becomes important once Barbados starts to gain independence, informing decisions as to why Barbados may not have became a republic as quickly as some of the other states would have. The Victorian plantation economy in Barbados also had a lot of implications for how Bajans themselves saw independence and whether or not they wanted to be even separate from the Queen or from, these British traditions. And so all of that is important. And I don't want to bore you all with history, but I do think that those are some important things to know.
No, I think we love the history here. I mean, one thing that I know, it's interesting you make that point about the settler sort of tourism angle is one of the lead, I think, one of the bad guys in the Salem witch trials was originally a failed plantation owner in Barbados, and then he went up to New England and started accusing people of being witches. That sort of, it's like if you're like a second son in England and don't have money, your family sends you to go like be a slave driver in Barbados, or that's the opportunity for you, I guess, at that time. Mm-hmm. So. And I don't think early Americans have the sense of how important the Barbados and other Caribbean islands are. Like that was the main reason. Like it wasn't to like have religious freedom in Massachusetts, right? It was to take the commodities out of the Caribbean and continue the slave trade.
And actually, sugar once informed the entire global political economy. And so when you think about how small the region is as a whole, comprised of those few islands and then some landed states, when we say that Caribbean sugar fueled the world economy at the time, and the world economy being that of empires, what we're talking about is deeply entrenched and very labor exploitative, equipment exploitative sugar production on the backs of enslaved Africans.
So, I mean, I want to talk a little bit, about what just happened, but out of curiosity, obviously there's going to be a huge historical and political holdover from this period. But did a lot of those families, those plantation owners and the kind of wealthy British folks, did they stick around, post-independence? Are they still sort of major players in the politics of Barbados, or have they been sort of pushed aside?
So what I like to call them is a permanent white settler tourist class. They are a part of the capitalist class. In fact, when you read a lot of historical literature on Barbados, they're referred to the local capitalist class. But what they are these white people from Britain that maintain generational wealth after, the slaves were emancipated. And even now, they still hold a lot of influence in Bajan society. And you see this throughout the Caribbean, where you have white settlers that have profited off of slavery, essentially still maintaining their economic legacies in these, in these regions. I like to tell people, we rarely see a lot of white people in Guyana. But when you look at wealth concentration, 31% of wealth is concentrated in like a 3% Portuguese population, Spanish population. And so when we talk about their economic power is deeply entrenched, and it's also large. And whereas you may see the political faces of the country being Black or Indian or mixed, you do still have this white, this wealthy class, capitalist class that benefited off of the plantation economy.
Yeah, I mean, you see that a lot. I mean, everywhere there was a British Empire, I feel like. Let's talk about, let's move to Mia Mottley. Introduce folks, if they're not familiar with Mia Mottley as a political figure, who she represents, and as well as any other prime movers for this republic, move to a republic.
So Mia Mottley is the current Prime Minister of Barbados, and she's well known internationally because of her conversation that she sparks on climate change. She's also well known internationally, or at least in the region, for her push for greater regionalism. Mm-hmm. And so externally or foreign policy wise, I would say that a lot of people who don't know much about Barbados politics would classify her as some sort of I guess in the US, they call everyone a communist, but they would classify her as some sort of, leftist that we should really get behind. But her agenda has mostly been externally driven. When her government came into power and they did have a majority, completely wiped out the opposition, the Bayesian economy was stagnant. And of course, you have rising inequality in Barbados. I was just talking to someone 2 days ago, one of my Bayesian friends, and we were talking about how if I'm in the US, I can buy a pair of these sunglasses, pretend that this is sunglasses, for $5 US. I go to Barbados and these same pair of sunglasses may cost me $100 to $200 US. Wow. Which Bayesian person is affording that? And so in a lot of these stores and places, this is also where you see a lot of the white settler, that permanent class I was talking to you guys about. And so Mia Mottley's external positioning is seen as very socially progressive, but internally we have it where there's rising inequality in Barbados. Because of this permanent settler tourist class, Barbados was actually one of the first Caribbean countries to diversify its economy towards tourism. Mm-hmm. And that also had a lot of implications for its independence in regards to how it treated foreign investment. The Bayesian Independence Party, the Labour Party, they actually provided lucrative tax incentives to foreign investors on the eve of its independence. It lauded itself for already having a Black population that was working in the services already because of tourism. And so you do have all of these issues that have worsened under Mia Mottley's presidency, of course, because of COVID as well, where you see unemployment and underemployment skyrocketing. Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about Mia Mottley, yes, Mia Mottley is someone who campaigned on republicanism. And I think for her personally, it was more so to push the idea that Barbados is a politically independent nation so that she could have more sway in these regional negotiations in the Caribbean. But outside of that, she didn't push republicanism through a constitutional reform or through a referendum or amendment. So what that means is that you literally are just getting that Barbados is now a republic, and we haven't even revised our constitution from these British social traditions and stuff. And you do have talks about the constitution changing next year, starting in January. And so it will be interesting to see how they change the Barbados constitution. And why is it important that Barbados became a republic and didn't make those changes to its constitution? It's because currently its constitution would still be pledging allegiance to, the Queen and these old British traditions, and not necessarily saying these are the promises that we are making to the people. And that is a huge mistake, because then you don't really know what the future struggles in Barbados would look like for the future. So when you think about countries in the Caribbean that do have independence, like Guyana, Trinidad, and Dominica, Guyana and Trinidad had strong Black power movements. They're multicultural societies, given the importation of indentured laborers into their countries, but also the fact that Guyana, Trinidad, and Dominica are three countries which went through different imperial hands during colonialism. And so you always had these competing white settler classes within them, that they needed to create those new constitutions so that they can say, we're governing for our people, we want economic justice, no labor exploitation, et cetera, et cetera. And you saw this whether or not the governments were, left or center left, as in, Guyana or Trinidad, or even if they were conservative, as we saw in Dominica at the time that it made those changes to its constitution. But because Barbados became a republic and it hasn't put forward any of those goals, it is purely symbolic. But even though it is purely symbolic, and this has been something Mia Mottley herself has been working on since 1988, I do think that it brings about three important changes or questions. So one, on the eve of its independence, you did have it where leaders in Barbados wanted Barbados to become a republic, but world events, external events made it so that it didn't happen. Outside of today, where it is a republic, the last biggest push happened around 2003 or 2004 when Prime Minister Owen Arthur, he change their Privy Council from being, British oriented to seeing the highest appellate court in Barbados being the Caribbean Court of Justice. And the reason that he did this is because he actually pointed out that the US and the UK were bullying Barbados to be supportive of the Iraq War. And he didn't like that. And so in that instance, you do see that external influence, and then them being, with the Queen as the head of state, having some sort of power there. So they did change they did change to the Caribbean High Appellate Court. Mia Mottley did say that Barbados was becoming a republic to just, finish what it should have started at independence. But also the Queen, when she became the head of state for a lot of countries in 1953, I think it was 67 countries back then. Today, now she's only the head of state for 14 countries, and 8 of them are in the Caribbean. And the Queen is an old lady. She's about to pass. I don't see any Caribbean countries necessarily doing these big ceremonial things to make Charles the new head of state. And so I do think that the tide towards becoming a republic in the Caribbean will happen soon. And obviously not wishing death on anyone, but especially as news of like the Queen and health conditions and staying out of the public eye is on the horizon.
I mean, I just wanted to note and hear your thoughts on this, because obviously where like the real goods are sort of moving into a different kind of legal tradition, right? Because if you're sort of operating under British law, that comes with its own weight. But people should be aware, and I'd be curious. Like they got rid of, for example, like the position of governor-elect, though, right? Where the Queen basically has an appointee. But I'm just saying this because, like, in Australia, because obviously, like, everyone sort of knows that, like, yes, it's a ceremonial position. But in the 70s, in Australia, the Queen actually did intercede in, like, the internal affairs and had a sitting prime minister step down. Now, obviously, the Queen doesn't want to do that typically because, one, her power is just weak in the sense that most people don't respect it. And I think that, it would be a constitutional crisis for her to try it again today. But like, those kind of like, even those symbolic powers, right? Every once in a while, they sort of, poke their head up in really troubling ways. So it is like, even if like it might seem outlandish today, it is worthwhile to sort of eradicate any kind of potential of, jolly old England sort of, sticking their head in internal politics in Barbados.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't want to downplay Barbados becoming a republic because it is a pivotal moment. I just want, I guess, make people aware that while this is a pivotal moment, we should also be looking at the constitutional end, and as you said, like those, what's changing legally. Because so far conversations from government officials in Barbados have said, oh, nothing is changing in Barbados, we're just a republic now. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that is enough. And so this is what I mean by Mia Mottley's external impact and how she's viewed externally versus how she's viewed internally. A lot of people internally were asking, okay, now we're a republic. Is that going to help the fact that we're underemployed, that COVID is here, that we don't have these tourists coming in that our country was dependent on? And so you still have those questions. And I also think it's important because unlike some of the other states who were able to become republics earlier on in the Caribbean, Barbados never had, and again, it's because of its history of this Victorian plantation social society, Barbados never had a super strong Black power movement in its country. So it never had these sort of pressures. In fact, its independence leader, Barrow, he basically said, Black power is an American import. We are fine being in service to these tourists that come. They're going to help us grow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's always been this putting the interests of the people in Barbados on the back burner. And I always tell people, Barbados is a beautiful country, but when I go there, the prices, I'm always, as someone coming from the US, it's like, who's affording this?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, is there anything else to be said about, you kind of talked about it, but the people's reaction to this broadly? Is there some excitement? Is this going to be like a winning? It sounds like a savvy move by Mottley to get maybe out, like you said, ahead of this sort of change.
So she definitely campaigned on republicanism, and she, push through that campaign promise. And so I do think that it'll bode well. I also think that choosing Rihanna as the first, national hero of Barbados was also very strategic. Mia Mottley herself is the first woman prime minister of Barbados. The president that was elected is also a woman, and now you have Rihanna as this national hero. I think that from changing out the symbol of the queen to these symbols of like people that Bajans actually love is something that bodes really well for Mottley's government politically. I also think that by her continuing to be vocal on issues of climate change, reparations, denouncing people saying that they shouldn't be doing trade deals or business with China at all, also bodes really well, because if people can see that those actual developments are happening, then of course you have some sort of placation from the fact that, inequality is rising, the economy isn't doing that great under COVID, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, you'll always have more people who are critical, who point out more importantly that none of these things are changing. But I do think that, again, people are happy about it. There's nothing to be sad about, getting rid of the queen. You do have the opposition government that is like, oh, you shouldn't have done this so quickly, yada, yada, yada. But also the opposition they did get wiped out. Let's be honest. So, yeah.
It's interesting, that thing about, we're a republic now, but everything's the same. Really reminds me of Joe Biden saying, nothing's going to fundamentally change. We can all just do this. You mentioned China. There's a headline from Bloomberg. Barbados splits from the Queen, trading one empire for another. The new republic should be wary of swapping the purely symbolic figurehead of the Queen for a deeper servitude to China. What's your reaction to that, Tamanisha?
So these rise of China and Barbados being subservient to China piece, I think what they really show is exactly why Barbados becoming a republic was a good move. Like, they're trying to harken back to these old imperial rivalries that you would have seen with like Britain and Spain and Britain and France and stuff. But it doesn't necessarily bode well. And so they did it in these sort of like fear mongering ways to say that, the Chinese are influencing your government, economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because they have to make it sound so much more worse than their actual imperialism, since people aren't going to want to identify with the US or these European powers that were already there, or places like Canada. And so I actually think, and this is a bonus for Mia Mottley having this sort of foreign policy vision that she does. She actually did do a great interview with, I think it was that BBC reporter, who essentially asked her like, oh, isn't Barbados selling itself out to China? And she pointed out that questions like that assume that people in Barbados cannot think or act for themselves, one, and that's also what not being a republic entail. And two, it also belies it also undercuts the fact that all countries are doing trade and business with China, including the United States. And I also have the view that China is engaged in capitalism. It is engaging with these states that are less developed than it. And it is doing so in a way where those states can sell their agricultural goods. And, people could say, oh, but it's stopping them from industrializing because they're just trading in these simple commodities. But that's what every single country has done. And so it's just like, that's just how the system works. So it's either you want to overthrow global capitalism, so that's not how states are functioning, or you just don't like the fact that China isn't an Anglo-Saxon country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's very well put. Anything else going forward? We talked about the need for a new constitution. What else is, I think, a severe priority for people in Barbados?
Not just for Barbados. So I guess that this could be my part where I'm a bit more hopeful for the future. But I'm hoping that Jamaica gets its act together soon, and also becomes a republic. And I say this because you've had it where in the past Jamaica has not been one of the states that really helped push sort of regional integration work or even federation. They've always been the first to back out and seen those things tumble. And something that was frustrating to me is, after Barbados became a republic, a lot of the major newspapers in Jamaica, they were asking, is it wise to name Rihanna the national hero? is Rihanna's dress too scandalous? And it's like, really, that's the main question that you got from Barbados becoming a republic. And I really think it's because of the capitalist relations and also capitalist foreign relations happening in Jamaica right now. So my hope is that within the next, hopefully, decade, you do see it where no state is holding the ceremony for Prince Charles to become a head of state. And these states all decide to become republics, and to see if that helps for more regional integration in the Caribbean. And one, I really think that more regionalism is necessary, because in moments like now where we have COVID, or even before all of these other external crises which super negatively impact the region, states have to, and states do realize that they have to work together. A couple months ago, I was on a conference call with Caribbean ambassadors and heads of states, and some heads of states and ambassadors from Africa. And what they were talking about was how they could share COVID vaccinations and other sorts of technologies with one another, with the recognition that, all of these big developed countries aren't coming to help them. And things like that make me really hopeful for the future, especially in regards to governance of the region, more so because I think that it makes people realize that we can't tackle this on our own. Because how are you going to compete with me for tourism if the tourists aren't coming? You had Barbados came out first as soon as COVID came, and within the first 2 months, I think Barbados put out that it set up isolation retreats for tourists to just come there and write and work from home inside of their retreats to bring them in. And it's like, really, that is all that you have to offer? It's sad.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting with the COVID vaccine technology. It's like mutual aid among, nations. Very interesting stuff. So, well, Tamanisha John, she's an associate professor, international relations at Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta, Georgia. Tamanisha, you can follow her at Tamanisha John. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
I appreciate it.
All right, folks, we'll take a quick break and we'll be right back. We're clear. All right, folks. Tamanisha she apologized for the history, but it's often the guests that do that are my favorite. That she's
No, the history is the best bit. I mean, that's how you I'm sorry, anyone can read headlines. Like being able to root yourself as to why things are the way they are. You're going to need to do the history.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the existentialist. I'm pretty sure. I would rather say Sartre, but maybe it was Heidegger. But your place in the world that you're thrown into. I don't know how else you really like get your bearings besides the best we can do for history. And of course, history is not a perfect, and it's subject to all sorts of biases, which makes it even more important to consider closely, in my opinion. But yeah, great interview.
No, she was a great guest. Well. We got to do Musk, man. And Musk is a funny one to talk about on the show because obviously I have nothing but disdain for him, and no doubt about it, it is personal. It became personal for me, really, certainly when he came to Austin, but I had already sort of not been a fan of him before that. When he sort of lied and was maligning these heroic divers who were helping those children in Southeast Asia who were stuck in a cave because they didn't want to use his like made up, submarine. I just sort of showed to me that not only is this a person that I just like personally don't like, it's a person I don't want to be in control of a lot of our resources, especially if those resources are sort of supposedly being put toward, I don't know, the future and how we're going to sort of live on this planet. He's somebody who certainly worries me for that.
I mean, just look at that submarine episode. The guy implied a rescue diver was a pedophile. Because he didn't want to use his submarine, and like that he just did that to millions of people. And then when I'm pretty sure there was a defamation lawsuit. Elon's like, I was just joking. That's tweets. Like, what kind of think about that level? That's like psychopathy to me. That's like, I don't care if we don't need to look for a gene in the brain for somewhere. That behavior is sociopathic. That's pathologically antisocial behavior, and like to the fact of like just not caring, just to not care about that, and to, obviously like you'd have all sorts of his little freaks looking into the guy's shit, like really despicable. I mean, and obviously the mass exploitation of and harassment of or abuse of workers is probably a bigger thing. But yeah, I agree. That was like, what do you do? This guy's screws.
Oh no, he certainly does. And I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get this to work on our computer so I can share these articles. Because the point is, though, is like this guy certainly has a screw loose. This guy as like a celebrity, right? As somebody who like people are interested in, is a very annoying person. But the reason we wanted to do a kind of longer segment on him today is, despite the fact that like, we're frustrated with him as like a character, this guy has ridiculous amounts of power and say in our society. And I really wanted to, I might just have to just read these titles out because I'm not able to share my screen. But we want to talk about a few different stories that I think really highlight some of the fundamental problems with this guy, Musk. And let's start from the small and get to the big. The first one is this story that I think a lot of people didn't catch. Came out earlier this week was that the federal government is investigating Tesla over claims related to solar panel fire risks. And this is coming from the Austin American-Statesman. Federal regulators have opened an investigation into Tesla after a former employee alleged the company failed to notify the public and shareholders about potential fire risks related to solar panels. Reuters news service first reported Monday that the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission was investigating the Austin-based automaker. Tesla did not respond to Reuters' questions, according to the news service. Stephen Hankes, a former Tesla employee who worked as a solar field quality manager, filed the complaint in 2019. Hankes was fired in 2020 and sued Tesla, alleging he was dismissed for retaliation. And essentially what he found, this guy was a quality control engineer, and he found out that Tesla did not alert its shareholders or the people who it had been installing these solar panels on their properties and their homes, that these solar panels were actually quite prone to flare-ups and to fires. that basically Tesla had information that these things were dangerous, that they were having serious malfunctions, and they hid that information from their shareholders and their customers. And this is a classic story. This is another point about Musk that we're going to get into throughout this, is that despite all this stuff that people like to say, oh my God, well, he's doing his things his own way, he's doing things differently. Before I was doing journalism, I used to work at an organization that sort of fought for corporate whistleblowers to come forward and to talk about things that their companies were doing that were putting the public at risk. This is the most classic shit that major corporations do. Somebody comes forward with serious concerns about the safety of the public and the customers and the shareholders, right? We might not, cry too much about them, but it still is worthwhile and important. It's serious information that, that should be made public and addressed. But instead, time and time again, major corporations, they isolate and humiliate and then terminate whistleblowers. And this is another example of it. And in this case, the stakes are quite high to imagine putting something on your home that could, potentially catch on fire. It's good that the federal government is investigating this thing, but this is not an isolated incident, because this goes throughout all of Musk's companies and endeavors. There's this kind of typical pattern of, one, exploiting people, bad work safety standards, and things like that. But also when there is a problem, lie, deceive, and try to run interference. I mean, it's really incredibly nasty stuff.
Yeah, this from a guy who, just look at the way he lies about, I'd call it lies, or overpromises about the miracles of his self-driving technology that it was supposed to be here by now. And this is a guy who will just lie about that. Of course he's going to lie about, or conceal as much as any fucking boss in this country would.
And we're going to get mainly to talk about Tesla, the car company. But I wanted to note, too, because we're going to play a video in a second about some of the statements that he's made about, what the federal government should and should not be doing. But I wanted to highlight that throughout Musk's kind of career, he is somebody who overpromises and underdelivers, and basically tries to, run interference and smoke shows to sort of hide what's actually going on. This is another thing that leaked over the break. Right here, Elon Musk says Raptor engine production is a disaster that puts SpaceX at risk of bankruptcy. This is why you shouldn't reading The Verge, so they're being cute with their titles. But on Black Friday, SpaceX CEO Elon Musk sent an anxious email to his company's employees, urging them to work over the weekend on SpaceX's Raptor engine line and describing the production situation as a crisis. In the email, a copy of which was obtained by The Verge, Musk argued that the company faces a genuine risk of bankruptcy if production doesn't increase to support a high flight rate of the company's new Starship rocket next year. The Raptor SpaceX's massive methane engine that will be used to propel the company's next generation launch system called Starship. SpaceX plans to use Starship to take people to deep space, and in April, NASA awarded SpaceX a $2.9 billion contract to develop Starship as a lunar lander to transport astronauts to the moon's surface as early as 2025. And the point here is that, this is another example of the difference between the on-the-ground reality of what Musk promises and what his companies are able to deliver and what the public perception of these things is. To give him credit where credit is due, the man does know how to play media narratives. This guy has, overseen, companies that have basically just been glorified government contractors for, over a decade and a half now, into companies that are now massively profitable, so profitable that the United States government is giving them money to develop our kind of spacefaring capabilities. It's egregious. But it just sort of shows the kind of touch and go operation that is happening behind the scenes. One of the major engineers on this project, resigned recently because they were worried about the kind of internal, antics within the company were going to prevent them from being able to deliver on these kind of projects. And now you're seeing the other side of that, is that it looks like they might be, that Musk is, getting worked up, over Thanksgiving weekend and calling people to come back into the office because they're not really able to maintain and to deliver on the things that they promise. And we're going to talk about Tesla car company in a minute, but again, this is a company that's valuation is all based for the most part. I mean, if you actually look at the nuts and bolts of the car company, what it is actually able to produce versus the major car companies around the globe, Tesla is a very, very small player. Why is it, the highest value car company in the globe? It's because people, investors, and now the public investors have bought into this kind of narrative that this is the future and this is going to pay off in the future, right? This is narrative, right? This is like telling a story. And this is why it's really important that we start to poke holes and expose this narrative, not just out of personal animus because we don't like this guy, but because there are consequences to giving somebody like this control a vast amount of not just resources in the sense of money, but, incredibly smart people who do work for these companies that want to do good work are sort of being forced and shoved in to work for a complete egomaniac like Musk. It's extremely wasteful of human potential and talent.
Yeah, I keep coming back to the word impresario to describe Musk, which is defined as a person who organizes and often finances concerts, plays, or operas. Like, these are big spectacles that he is financing, and it hasn't seemed to matter yet that the return on these spectacles isn't going to be what he actually promises, right? He just had to recall an autopilot update because you get something called phantom braking, which I don't know if you've ever been on a highway. Not something you want to just happen on in a car, is your brakes to go, right? and we haven't got to the cars yet, but I just want to say, while it's on my mind, I keep seeing these, I see a lot of crash videos, and we'll see some of Tesla's autopilot going wrong. The stuff where it's going right is stuff that a 16-year-old driver would do right? It's like, oh, look at this, avoid this obstacle. And it's like, yeah, I fucking did that, when I was going through puberty. And the baseline will be when you consistently, first of all, you don't see all these things where it's just cream and cones because it can't figure out that it's in a construction zone. It will be when you see videos of the cars avoiding obstacles in a way a human couldn't. That's when you want to get into a self-driving car, and that's not that's a decades off, basically.
And we'll get more into the car stuff in just a moment, but it should be noted that other companies that have been sort of trying to, like Google for years is working on trying to create a autopilot system. They decided against it, pursuing it with the kind of fervor that they had been, because they didn't think that the technology was there. They didn't think that it was safe, and that they didn't, as a company, want to be associated with something that made people feel unsafe and was a failure. Not saying this to put a little halo on Google's head, but it should be noted, that Musk's kind of ability and innovation is actually just a wanton, kind of attitude. He has a very glib attitude toward human safety and human life. And yeah, we'll get to the car stuff. Is really fascinating the more that you actually start looking under the hood. But before we get there, I just wanted to also note the role that he's playing politically. This is him complaining about Joe Biden's Build Back Better, right? And look, we criticize that plan a hell of a lot on the show. It is nowhere near close to what we need, to be doing, not only just to kind of kickstart the American economy to put more money in working people's pockets, but to start to deal with the very real threat of climate change, something that Elon Musk, presents himself as somebody who's trying to come up with the solutions for it. We'll get to why that shit is not the case in just a moment. But this is his kind of response. Talking again, to go back to Musk, people try to act like Musk is some kind of new version of capitalism, some nice, sweet version of capitalism. Same kind of shit as ever. This is him talking to the Wall Street Journal against a major government program.
Then, at a certain point, really what you're doing is capital allocation. So you're not. It's not money for personal expenditures. What you're doing is capital allocation, and it does not make sense to take the job of capital allocation away from people who have demonstrated great skill in capital allocation and give it to an entity that has demonstrated very poor skill in capital allocation, which is the government. You can think of the government essentially as a corporation in the limit. The government is simply the biggest corporation with a monopoly on violence, and where you have no recourse. So how much money do you want to give that entity?
So that's what this guy thinks about the government. And like, certainly, the U.S. government is controlled for the most part by the super wealthy and the elite in this country. But it is still something on some levels that has the potential of being answerable to the public. Unlike companies like Tesla, unlike people like Elon Musk. So it's really rich for him to go on about that. But I really wanted to focus on his first bit about capital allocation. Talking about himself as somebody who's very good at allocating capital. You look time and time again at what Musk has done with the money that he's come into. It has been buying himself access to already existing companies, right? You look at the solar company, buys it. A part of him buying it is requiring it to list him as a founder. You look at SpaceX, same thing, buys it. Now Musk gets to present himself as a founder of a company that he didn't found. Tesla, another example of that. Musk is somebody who his great wisdom of capital allocation is finding ways to buy himself access to boardrooms across the country so that he can take credit for other people's work, right? And beyond that, what has happened with those companies under his stewardship, right? You look at, a company like SpaceX. We're looking at an example right now where he's worried that company is about to go bankrupt, not just with his money, but with money that was allocated to him by the government. So unless he's trying to do some kind of incredible experiment where he is just continuing, and by the way, that doesn't even get into all of the subsidies that Musk and his companies have received over the past 10 years. In 2015, there was a report in the LA Times that he's got somewhere close to $500 million alone in just, government subsidies. So this is somebody who has profited immensely off of the kind of generosity and, I don't know, faith of the U.S. government, something that needs to end right now. But it's rich for someone like that, somebody who's personally profited so much from government allocation of resources, to now sit around and act like he's somebody who has a deeper understanding of these things. When you look at the actual success rate of these organizations that he's been in charge of, they have not been impressive on any kind of nuts and bolts, open up the books, let's see how profitable these companies are level. This is somebody who's wasted a lot of people's money and time and now our resources, and does not have too much to show for it.
Yeah, I love the bit, and chat, let me know if my mic is still messing up. Do I sound okay, David?
You sound beautiful to me, Matt.
So this thing where he says capital allocation, it doesn't make sense to take it from, and he can't say capitalists because people would be like, fuck you. Yeah, so, right? So he says the people who have been demonstrated competent at allocating capital. And as you said, first of all, motherfucker, the government has a much better track record, in my opinion. I'll put it up against private capitalists any day. I mean, the fucking internet, just to go through the litany of the tradition here, obviously, space travel tech itself, rocketry,
cell phones. Come on, I mean, this
GPS,
well versed in these arguments,
right?
The government's ability to research and discover new technologies has been. And it's mainly because the United States has so many resources that it has, pillaged from the rest of the world. But the ability of the United States government to fund really, really breakthrough technological breakthroughs is unmatched, certainly by any kind of private corporation, right? Yeah. Maybe the Chinese or the Soviet Union are probably the only real competition that we have there, right? Yeah, I mean, it's really ridiculous. And I mean, beyond that, it shows that Musk, for the most part, is talking to people with very, very little kind of historical or political education. I mean, even his kind of thing about the government having the monopoly on violence, right? That's really only impressive to people if you haven't had much experience with kind of very, very early sociology, entry level intro course sociology. But I wanted to note, because we only played that little bit of the clip there, that the longer version of this clip is him really railing against subsidies. So he's railing against the Build Back Better plan because he doesn't think that electric vehicles should enjoy the kind of subsidies that have given him the foothold in the market, right? And there's a very, very simple version of that, right, which I think most people can recognize, that he doesn't want to see his competition sort of benefit from the systems that have benefited him in the past, because he knows that as more and more competition starts to enter into the market, this very serious problems with Teslas are going to be exposed. But before we even get there, I just wanted to note one thing in particular that he was very worked up about was this desire of the Biden administration to invest massively in electric vehicle charging stations across the country, something that Musk called, ridiculous. Well, why would Musk be against installation of more electric vehicle charging stations? Well, in the same way that Apple acts like monopoly and many of these other technology companies just sort of try to sit on advancement and come up with ridiculous ways to milk money from their customer base, Tesla is no different from that, because they use a very, very special and unique charger for their electric vehicle charging stations. Meaning that if the United States was to sort of implement a universal charging station system across the country, that Teslas would either not be able to charge at those stations without an adapter, right? Or they might be forced to change the systems that they have already, created, again, so that they can make sure that if you own another kind of competition vehicle, you can't go to a Tesla charging station, right? It's all about kind of needless exclusivity. And this is not something that serves any kind of actual technical value other than making something so that only Tesla users feel like, that they're the only people who are able to use these kind of higher end stations. Yeah,
that's all they got is let's do the lightning connector thing and exclusive dongles. Like a great innovation.
A big out screen, a screen that's much bigger than any other kind of screen that automakers would put into their car, because they're not safe. Let's get into some of this. Because should we do the autopilot stuff first, or should we talk, or should we note a couple things about the viability of Tesla cars, their longevity?
Well, let's do the theory first, and then we can show the practice.
Okay.
Oh, the longevity stuff. Okay, yeah, let's talk about the
I just want to note this, please look. I know some people like Teslas out there, and look, it's not my bag, but I can say that they look sort of cool, and I'm sure they're very, very fun to drive. I'm sure they're much nicer than the car that I have, which is probably I think 23 years old at this point. But the difference between my car and a Tesla? My car has lasted for 23 years on the road. A Tesla certainly will not. So all Teslas, the way that they are made, they are extremely cheap. And they are disposable cars. There are so many stories of these big Tesla bros out there getting a little fender bender, nothing too big, something that any kind of, mechanic worth their salt, anyone who does any body work worth their salt should be able to fix. They go in and they try to get their car fixed for a little ding or something like that. And they get told by Tesla that, no, we actually just need to replace the entire car. The entire car? Are you kidding me? Yeah. It's because the bodies of those cars are made out of aluminum. And aluminum is very cool for making the car look really sleek and also for making it lightweight. But it essentially makes it close to impossible, at least on an affordability scale, for the people to be able to do kind of minor repairs to the car. Meaning that most of these cars are not designed with the idea of we want this to last for decades. They are meant to be just like your iPhone, something that you can drive for 5, 6, 7 years. So all of this shit about environmentalism and waste, you are far better off, right? Continuing to drive a car that uses gasoline than, buying something like a Tesla that takes incredible amounts of resources to produce, right? But that's even just assuming that maybe the Tesla could last 20 years. You are certainly much better. Your environmental footprint is much better if you continue to drive, an older gas vehicle, than buying a car that is not even likely to be able to be on the road. If it has any kind of, minor damage to it over the next few years, right? These are cars that just are not designed to be long-lasting vehicles. And it makes sense because Tesla, as a corporation, is not a car company that has been very interested in making cars affordable for the vast majority of Americans. It's a car company that is sort of aimed at a very specific type of, wealthy, elite Americans as a way for them to sort of express themselves as people who care about the future, people who care about technology and all this kind of stuff. And look, I'm not going to sit here and get super worked up at somebody for driving or enjoying a Tesla car, but I am going to talk about like the large scale effects of this company on our society and what that really does mean for us as we're trying to chart out a future in this country, to make sure that we're able to sort of meet our immediate needs today, right? The transportation needs that we have today, with balancing that with the very serious impending and ongoing catastrophe that is climate change, right? And this is just not somebody who's expressing to me. This is not somebody who I have a lot of confidence in, sort of leading us out of this problem. And you look at their entire history, and you see fraud. You see things that are not very well thought out. And then you see this kind of disposability mindset, even with something that is supposed to be environmental and green and, ecologically friendly.
Yeah, I mean, and it does suck that he really is capitalizing on basically on empowered consumers' desires to believe that they're doing something, right? Like he basically cornered that market, and I mean that's the first people I'm bluffing. I don't know anybody that has a Tesla, but I guess when I see them driving down the street, I don't think of a person I don't think they're like an Elon, right? I think they're like a very high earning liberal, and think that this is all we need to do is get electric cars, and everything's going to be.
Well, I mean, I know you've expressed, and I know we should maybe do a whole thing. Like there is something kind of there is also a problem with like the whole electric car solution to these things in general, because the long view that we have to have is that the proliferation and maintenance of mass scale 300 million Americans all having private vehicles is just not very sustainable. Even if they are not using gas at the pump, electricity production doesn't just happen, right? We're not catching thunderbolts and powering our cars with them. Like there are fuels that are used to produce lots of electricity. Obviously there's other versions that we want to be following, but what I'm saying, like electricity itself does not necessarily mean that it's clean. But we can't get into that because we still have so much to get to with the danger of this shit. But I just had to let that be said, that there are just fundamental flaws with the design of the Teslas themselves. But let's get to this, because I think one thing that's really alarming to both Matt and I is the automated system in these Teslas. Not only because there's this hubris around it, but we're finding out that these are extremely dangerous, and that they've been sort of forced onto our public roads without a lot of consideration for their safety. And this is an issue of public safety first, but it's also an issue of democracy. I do not want to live in an open playground for a guy like Musk to, frankly, I just wanted to be very clear, because I know some people, this is out on the internet and a lot of different people are going to be watching this. I don't feel too much of a need to kind of personally come at Tesla owners or even people who are interested in Musk and all this kind of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. I think that what he actually does is quite cynical and sinister, because he does heavily imply that he sort of figured out solutions to these problems, that his products work. And we can drop all the environmental stuff. We can drop what I was talking about the aluminum cars. This stuff with autopilot in these Tesla cars, it is fraud. He's defrauded I think people, his investors, and he's defrauded the public, and certainly his customers, because the fact is as much winking as he does is saying well, you actually still need to pay attention to the road when you're driving my cars. He tries to make it seem, he heavily implies that they've sort of figured this out, and that this stuff is ready to go. So again, I don't want to focus too much on individual consumers of like Tesla products, right? But I want to note that this is an issue of democracy and public safety, right? And that we should not be exposed to unsafe vehicles on the road because some guy basically refuses to listen to the federal government when it comes to putting in kind of basic safety measures in his car. And there needs to certainly be a reckoning with him on this.
Yeah, I mean, this is a commons issue, right? This is him using the public roads and us pedestrians as test subjects, right? This is, and nobody signed any waivers. In academia, they have really strict requirements on if you're going to participate in an experiment. And Tesla is doing all these experiments every day on you, collecting you crossing the road, saying, hey, don't hit that. And hopefully it's right. But who knows? Like, I mean, I know I feel weird when I cross the street right in front of a Tesla.
And there are too many of them around here, man, because all these freaks are moving here from all over, I was going to say California, but all over the country, who are just like Musk super fans. Like, they want to sit here and get like a front row seat to whatever freaky ass shit he's going to put out there. And it makes me very worried in a state like Texas, which has just sort of so much gutted consumer protections. I mean, Texas used to be a state where we had these kind of super radical consumer protection lawyers who came after everybody. And years and years and years of that have GOP like government have sort of come at that. I don't want to do a whole history of like Texas litigation, but it is very scary, right? To see, the reasons he came to a state like this is because he thinks that he can get away with a lot more than he could have in California. I want to look at this one right here because this was a New York Times story that is quite serious. Inside Tesla, Elon Musk pushed an unflinching vision for self-driving cars. The automaker may have undermined safety in designing its autopilot driver assistance system to fit its chief executive's vision, former employees say. And throughout the story, you basically are painted a picture of somebody who refused to listen to the engineers and the people who sort of understand how to make a car and how to make a car safe, and bucked the trend of what other car companies were doing. And he likes to present himself as like, well, I'm a maverick. The reason that other car companies weren't willing to do this is because they didn't want to put out cars that were unsafe. Let me get here, right here. We got, there's a long talk about like how he sort of tried to force them to put in very specific aesthetic choices in the cars that probably weren't the best safety or efficiency solutions. But this one is quite frightening. Hardware choices have also raised safety questions. Within Tesla, some argued for pairing cameras with radar and other sensors that worked better in heavy rain and snow, bright sunshine, and other difficult conditions. For several years, Autopilot incorporated radar. And for a time, Tesla worked on developing its own radar technology. But 3 people who worked on the project said Mr. Musk had repeatedly told members of the Autopilot team that if humans could drive with only 2 eyes, that meant that, and that this meant cars should be able to drive with cameras alone. They say he saw this as returning to first principles, a term Mr. Musk and others in the technology industry have long used to refer to sweeping aside standard practices and rethinking problems from scratch. Yeah. Oh, this is a great line here, too. In May of this year, Mr. Musk said on Twitter that Tesla was no longer putting radar in new cars. He said the company had tested the safety implications of not using radar, but provided no details, right? I mean, this is rich stuff. Let me see. I mean, there's so much. There's other aspects in here, too.
But can I just comment on the radar thing? Like, you want to be better than humans, you fucking dickhead. Like that, right? Who cares that we only use 2 eyes? Let's be better than, let's use 8. Like, use however many it needs to get me and my family home fucking safe, and so you don't kill any pedestrians.
In 2014, Tesla began putting radar on its Model S sedans. This is just I'm just saying, like, this is just one example that you can imagine is going on all across the board, from the cars to SpaceX to the solar panels to the batteries, right? The kind of hoops that people have to sort of jump through to appease this guy are absurd. And this is, again, why we should not be allocating this person public money. And they should be investigated for what they've been doing over the past few years. Anyways, so Tesla puts in radar in their 2014 model, but Mr. Musk did not like the way the radar looked inside an open hole in the front of the cars and told his engineers to install a rubber seal, according to two people who worked on the project at the time, even though some employees were warned that the seal could trap snow and ice and prevent the system from working properly. These people said the company went ahead with Mr. Musk's instructions without testing the design in winter weather, but resolved the situation after customers complained that the radar stopped working in winter weather. Well, I'm really happy that they that the people told you up front that this wasn't going to work, but you put that out on the road for a while, and put people at risk and just created needless headaches to kind of appease your really bizarre aesthetic sensibilities.
Yeah, well, as a North Dakotan, I can tell you that it's actually fine because winter is a notoriously safe time to be to piloting an automobile, because if you get in a crash, there's all that fluffy snow to crash into and you don't really get hurt.
That's true. It's beautiful. And, and as you go through that story, they sort of break down what we are hitting at and what we're learning on a public scale now. I mean, I believe it's 18 people who have passed away at this point, who have died as a result of these cars driving on autopilot and killing people. Right? Needless deaths to satisfy the ego of this person, right? Deaths that not only were preventable, it took incredible willingness to ignore the kind of early warning signs that this system was not ready to go out to the public. Look, I'm not an engineer, which is why I listen to folks who know better than me. But from what I've heard, the problems with this autopilot system are, one, that it just is not able to sort of work through the myriad of different kind of situations that you face on the road, especially on roads of all different sizes and climates and weather, right? I mean, this is they promote this vehicle as this autopilot system as something that can work anywhere in the United States. Surely can't. And beyond that, other people, the other competition who really do want to see this kind of system work, who really do want to see the potential for cars to be able to operate on our roads, do not pursue this technology in the way that Tesla does. As I mentioned earlier in this segment, Google, one of their major competition, in this space, decided that they would rather, work on this slowly rather than put out a system that could potentially create, kill people, maim people, cause massive amounts of property damage, etc. Right? Like, other people in the space have said, hey, the technology just is not there yet, including with radar, right? So it's bad enough that Musk is sort of handicapping the process by removing another kind of sensor, right? And the reason that you want to have another kind of sensor like radar in addition to a camera is because computer cameras get confused, right? There's a lot. I mean, hell, the naked eye gets confused. So you want to have as many sensors out there as possible to be able to push back against the system if it's going to do something egregious, like we're about to watch in a moment. But look, this is just something that, like, people within the space are saying the technology is not here yet. People within the company are privately coming forward and saying the technology is not here yet, and we're actually being stifled by the top of this company. And it's, you know, it's having very serious human consequences. But that's the Tesla game. Anytime that he gets criticized publicly by anybody, he immediately starts to come at their character, make wild insinuations. We talked about earlier about what he did to somebody who was just trying to save children who were trapped in a cave, who were in the dark for days, right? Worried about how they were going to get out. Musk was mad because some diver said that he didn't need his insane and ridiculous submarine. So he went out publicly and maligned this person, saying that they were a pedophile with no evidence or anything like that, right? This is what he does, and he's done it time and time again. Whenever so many journalists have come forward, and Musk, you know, sends his army of Twitter folks at him, and then you have an entire tech media that just continues to report this stuff unquestioningly, right? They're like, Musk said this, so it must be true. And what we see when these things actually come out onto the road, when these things actually are tried, they're unsuccessful.
Yeah. He's Elizabeth Holmes with just a little bit more empowered to like command engineers. Yeah.
Well, let's look at this because this is one of Matt's favorite pastimes.
There's a website real quick called tesladeaths.com. And you can look at, and they mark who died and if autopilot is claimed. And the recent one in New York, it looks like a guy was changing his tire and got smoked by a Tesla in autopilot. So it's like you're pulled over, you're changing a flat. Do you trust a person just driving a car more, or do you trust somebody on Tesla looking at their iPad or the giant iPad they put on the screen?
Which you can play video games on while you're driving the car. Just absurd. Yeah. But watch this and tell me if you feel safe with these vehicles on the road. Hilarious caption.
Elon Musk, yeah, he probably doesn't. Look at that. Not knowing it's a hill. Well, I mean, that's just not knowing it's a hill, right? Things that a human can know. Yeah, that's outrageous. It's like, yeah. It's so... I mean, some of these are kind of humorous, but...
No, but we've played plenty of videos on the show of these vehicles, really failing on the road, and like all the times these videos are uploaded by believers,
right? Yeah.
By people who want this system to work, right? These are people who are Tesla owners. They're very excited by these new updates to the autopilot system, and they want it to happen. And it's scary. And we played one, I wish we had it in front of us right now, but we played one a few weeks ago where like this guy who is an early adopter for this system was driving around New York, and had to jump in at the last second to stop his car from running over about 15 different pedestrians, people, because it's New York City, it's crowded, right? And the car just made an errant right turn, and he had to stop it from causing a very serious injury to folks. And thank God he was behind the wheel. But the problem with the autopilot technology is one, that it fails, and two, it just is not in our nature to sit around and have something automated and to expect that all drivers are going to be able to take control of a situation when the system fails. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
If you're distracted, if you've been on the road for 15 minutes and it's working well, and then all of a sudden the car does something, absurd, to have like the kind of awareness of what's going on around you, how fast your car is moving, where your feet should be. You know what I mean? Like everyone, most people who watch this drive, y'all know what I mean. It's a kind of absurd expectation in the first place. But beyond all this is just not something that is safe to be on our roadways right now. And I'm happy to see that there's some level of investigation, but this stuff should never have been able to come to market until it had been proved extensively. And that's the thing that's so frightening, is that you get the kind of media spectacle around the future of automaking and what Musk is doing, what Tesla is doing. And it's completely incongruent with like the actual reality of it. And the problem with that is not just that some people are being under-delivered and might be sad because their cars aren't working the way that they want to, that it actually creates a very serious public safety risk for the rest of us.
Yeah, and just one more note on the video technology that's used for this autopilot stuff. When you do a CAPTCHA, and to log in somewhere and it shows you like a street sign or something like that, and you have to identify what it is. The reason it's having you do that is because the computer can't, and it's trying to teach the computer using human beings, like what is a street sign, what's this or that, right? And because a thing that computer just imagery is really bad at doing is it can tell a human, but a partially obscured anything gets all of a sudden very tricky for a computer. Like what's a quarter of an apple, right? Like what's this little thing? And that's like the problem it's running up against. So that you're reacting, think of how like CAPTCHAs work. That's the state of like the sort of visual identification technology, and it's not very good. And you wouldn't want to rely on it for your safety as a pedestrian.
Absolutely. I mean, we've watched videos where that system is getting confused by the moon. And, maybe that's the most human thing about this whole system so far. I mean, the moon has always been something of fascination to us. We've come up with some wild stories and mythologies around it. But I don't want that shit behind the wheel of thinking that the moon is a stoplight and that it's just stopped in the middle of a highway where people are going 80 miles an hour. No, thank you, son.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, I wish I could say this was the last one, but this asshole not only is getting a lot of government money, local governments around the country are sort of being are buying into all of his scams. It's certainly a Musk problem. Don't get me wrong, but it does show the kind of decline of American local governments, that this guy has been able to get so much leeway with cities and localities across the country. This is somebody who, just look what he did here in Texas is, he got a tax break from the local school system, upwards of $64 million. Money was essentially taken from the pockets of our local education system for, young people who should be getting much, much more than they are right now. And what is the benefit of that for our community and our society? It certainly is not trickling down to the rest of us. It's creating an extremely high wage earner in the communities, which is driving up housing prices and services for the people who are actually from here, who have roots here, all while basically refusing to pay taxes, continuing to get government to benefit from government subsidies and government programs, with the media that's sort of willing to play ball. And it has to stop, because again, like at first when Musk was doing the goofy stuff and he had the Tesla company, we thought it was funny, and obviously we don't like rich people in general. But this is somebody who is now getting more and more influence and leeway from governments, and I think that shit needs to stop right now. Well, y'all, we'll be taking some more energy into the post game. We got a whole labor wave, baby. We can come up with a segment title for it, but Matt and I realize this like every week we're needing to cover unionization efforts and strikes. We want to come up with a title for segment. So if anyone has ideas for that, let us know. I also think it might be fun if anyone has. I know we have some musicians out there and people might be interested in it. But if anyone wants to come with like a little intro song for I don't know, our worker segment, that could be fun. As always, you can email us at leftreckoning@gmail.com. This weekend, we're going to be reading Vladimir Lenin, some introductory texts that he wrote into Marxism, and also his letter to the American workers. I'm really looking forward to that. I don't know how. Have you read much Lenin in the past, Matt?
I have. Let me mute that. I have read the State and Revolution. I think that's a shorter one, right?
Relatively, definitely way longer than the texts we're reading this weekend are pretty short, so people can read this too. But yeah,
right. Yeah, and maybe a few other things, but never in any kind of like concerted way. It was just one afternoon I was on a bus to Philly and read some Lenin.
He'll put some energy in you though, man. Like, Alexander Coburn, one of my favorite writers. Somebody, I've really been enjoying talking about Hitchens and stuff like that with Ben, but Alexander Coburn is somebody way more, I think, fulfilling for people to discover now and go back and read their writings. Really incredible journalist and writer and Marxist. But he always said whenever his dad was a very famous Marxist, Claude Coburn, and whenever little young Alexander Coburn would come in being sad or depressed because, some girl dumped him or something like that, his dad would tell him to go and pick up off of the shelf a little bit of Lenin. And as much as, Coburn sort of thought that was funny at first, did find that like there is nothing that will sort of get the spirits high and the senses stimulated as like a good, Lenin takedown. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with y'all this weekend for patrons, and you can support us at patreon.com/leftreckoning. Next week we'll be joined by Liza Featherstone to talk about masculinity in the left. I'm really looking forward to that. I mean, is there anything else we should be plugging?
No, we will discuss Enos Kanter in the post game.
Looking forward to that.
Defense.
Enos Freedom, Matt. Freedom.
I'm gonna dead name him.
And I guess we'll find out about the early. We'll find about the early any results from the Shama Sawant too. Maybe haven't had a chance to keep up with even live. So a lot to cover. We'll see you all in a little bit in the post game. What, 15-20 minutes?
Yep, 15-20 minutes. See you folks. Peace out.